For 12 years, Fairfield detectives believed they knew who killed Katelyn Markham. They just couldn't prove it. The man they suspected was someone Katelyn had trusted completely. Someone who had sat across from investigators, answered their questions, and walked out of every single interview a free man. He did that for 12 years. And while investigators circled the same name, year after year, interview after interview, that man moved to a new city. He entered a new relationship. He built a new life. Katelyn's family had no such option. On the night of August 19, 2011, Katelyn Markham, 22 years old, an artist, a fiancée, a daughter with an appointment to meet her father the following morning, walked out of her home in Fairfield, Ohio, and was never seen alive again. Her purse was on the counter. Her ID was in the house. Her car sat untouched in the driveway. 2 years later, her remains were found in a rural field in a neighboring county. Miles from her home. Miles from anything that could explain how she got there. And the man investigators kept returning to? He wasn't charged for another decade after that. What took so long? And what finally changed? That is the real story of what happened to Katelyn Markham. And it is more disturbing, and more complicated, than almost anyone on the outside knew. To understand why this case consumed investigators for more than a decade, you first have to understand who they were fighting for. Katelyn Markham grew up in the Fairfield area of Butler County, Ohio, suburban Cincinnati, the kind of mid-sized American community where high school sports still matter and everyone's story overlaps with everyone else's at the edges. She was, by every account from people who knew her, genuinely talented. Not in the vague, encouraging way that people describe young people they love. In the specific, demonstrable way that gets noticed. She was an artist. A graphic design student. Her sketchbooks were filled with detailed illustration work, the kind of work that makes people stop and look twice. She was building toward a career that would let her do what she loved for the rest of her life. She was engaged to a man named John Carter. They had been together for years. She had recently moved into her own place in Fairfield, a home she was making her own, one of the first real markers of adult independence. She had a morning appointment on August 20th. Her father. Simple, ordinary plans. The kind you make when you fully expect your life to continue the way it has been going. Those plans were the last ordinary thing in Katelyn Markham's story. Because on the night before that appointment, something happened at or near that house in Fairfield that would take investigators more than a decade to bring before a judge. August 19, 2011. A Friday evening in late summer. Katelyn was at her home in Fairfield. She was in contact with people throughout the day and into the evening. Her phone was active. Her plans were ordinary. John Carter, her fiancé, was not at the house that night. Accounts placed him elsewhere. Where exactly, and for how long, and what his movements looked like across the full span of those hours, these became questions investigators returned to over and over in the years ahead. At some point during that Friday night, all contact with Katelyn Markham stopped. The precise time of her last confirmed communication has been referenced in legal proceedings. What is documented publicly is the result: the calls and messages stopped. And they never started again. The following morning, Katelyn didn't show up to meet her father. That was the first signal that something was wrong. When investigators checked on her, here is what they found. Her purse was inside the house. Her identification was inside the house. Her car was sitting in the driveway, undisturbed. Nothing packed. Nothing taken. No note. No message to family. No phone call explaining an absence. Just silence, and everything she would have needed to go anywhere still sitting exactly where she had left it. Now hold those facts together for a moment. A woman disappears without her ID. Without her car. Without her purse. Without telling a single person she was leaving. On the night before a scheduled morning appointment with her father. That is not what a voluntary departure looks like. Investigators knew it almost immediately. And it pointed them, almost immediately, toward the question that would define the next 12 years. Who was the last person with her? Within days of Katelyn's disappearance, John Carter was sitting across from Fairfield detectives. He answered their questions. He gave them a timeline of where he had been on the night of August 19th. He was cooperative, or at least presented as cooperative. And then he stood up and walked out. No arrest. No charge. Not even a hold. At this stage, investigators had no body. No confirmed crime scene. No physical evidence establishing that a crime had definitively occurred rather than a voluntary disappearance. Without those anchors, there was no legal basis to detain him. Carter knew that. Whether or not he acted on that knowledge is what investigators spent the next 12 years trying to establish. What investigators did have in those early weeks was a set of details about the relationship between Carter and Katelyn that they found worth examining. Their relationship had not been without friction in the period leading up to her disappearance. People close to them described tensions, financial pressure, strain between the two of them, that painted a picture somewhat different from what Carter presented to detectives. None of that was evidence of a crime. People in complicated relationships disappear for reasons entirely unrelated to those complications. Investigators had to follow the evidence, not their instincts. But their instincts kept pointing in the same direction. And in the weeks and months that followed, as searches turned up nothing and tips dried up and Katelyn remained missing, those instincts only hardened. One of the early investigative tools was Katelyn's phone. Who she'd called. Who had called her. The timestamps. The cell towers her signal had bounced off in the hours before contact stopped. Investigators pulled what they could. They examined call logs, tower data, the general geographic picture of where phones had been during the relevant hours. They looked for gaps, inconsistencies, moments where someone's account didn't match what the records showed. What the phone records showed in those early months was enough to be interesting. It was not enough to be conclusive. And in a homicide investigation built substantially on circumstantial evidence, interesting is not the same as prosecutable. Prosecutors make charging decisions based on what they believe can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt in front of a jury, not on what investigators believe, and not on what seems likely. That standard is deliberately high. Whether the evidence fell short of that standard in 2011 because of the limits of forensic technology, because the full evidentiary picture hadn't yet been assembled, or because prosecutors simply weren't yet confident they could win, that distinction has never been fully established in the public record. What is established is the result: no charges were filed. Investigators kept working. They kept interviewing. They kept watching. And then, in 2013, the nature of the case changed entirely. Human remains were discovered in Preble County, Ohio. Preble County sits to the west of Butler County, where Fairfield is located. Rural land. The kind of landscape that can hold what it hides for extended periods without anyone noticing. The identification process began. And when it concluded, investigators confirmed what Katelyn's family had feared for 2 years. The remains were Katelyn's. Now think carefully about what the location of those remains told investigators. Katelyn did not drive herself to Preble County. She had no car, her car was in her driveway in Fairfield. She didn't walk there. There was no public transit, no ride record, no witness who saw her traveling. Someone brought her there. A specific person, with access to a vehicle, with a reason to put distance between Katelyn's body and wherever she had actually died, had transported her remains to that rural location and left her there. That is not random. That is not coincidence. That is deliberate concealment, the behavior of someone managing the aftermath of a crime. Someone who needed Katelyn to be somewhere else. The geography of where she was found was itself evidence. It pointed directly toward a person who had been with her, who knew what had happened, and who had taken steps to prevent or delay discovery. It pointed, once again, to someone who knew her well. Investigators now had a confirmed homicide. They had a body found miles from her home in a location that required deliberate transportation. They had a person of interest who had been in their sight since the first week. What they still did not have was the evidentiary package that could walk into a courtroom and hold up under cross-examination. That gap was about to stretch for another 10 years. At some point after Katelyn's remains were identified, John Carter left the Fairfield area. He relocated to another part of Ohio. He entered a new relationship. He built, from the outside, a new life. Katelyn's family had no equivalent option. You do not rebuild when the question of what happened to your daughter is officially unanswered. You wait. You advocate. You make phone calls and give interviews and show up at events to make sure her name stays in the public record. You do that for years. And then you do it for more years. Carter's new life and Katelyn's family's suspended grief existed simultaneously, in the same state, for nearly a decade. What the public could not see during that time was that the investigation had not stopped. Evidence was being re-examined. Witnesses were being re-interviewed. New forensic methods were being applied to existing materials. The file stayed open. Forensic science was changing in ways that matter for cases like this one. Cell phone location data was becoming more granular and more legally admissible. Digital forensics on older devices was improving. Genetic genealogy, the use of public DNA databases to connect suspects to crime scenes, had, by the early 2020s, solved cases that had seemed permanently closed. Whether any of these specific advances played a direct role in building the case against Carter has not been fully detailed in public records. What changed the prosecution's assessment, whether it was new forensic analysis, a witness who finally said something different, physical evidence re-examined with updated methods, or the accumulated weight of everything investigators had built across a decade, is not fully known. But something changed. Then investigators did something they had been unable to do for more than 12 years. They put handcuffs on the one person they'd never stopped looking at. 12 years, 7 months, and 29 days after Katelyn Markham disappeared from her home in Fairfield, Ohio, John Carter was arrested and charged in connection with Katelyn's death. For those who had followed the case, locally and nationally, the announcement arrived with a particular weight. Not the clean satisfaction of a mystery solved, because mysteries like this one don't resolve cleanly. But something. An acknowledgement that the long suspension was over. Katelyn's family responded publicly. 12 years of advocacy, of keeping her name in the news, of insisting that time was not a reason to stop looking. The arrest did not restore what had been taken from them. But it meant that someone was finally going to be compelled to stand in front of a court and answer for what investigators believed he had done. Carter, by the time of his arrest, was living a life that looked nothing like the one he'd shared with Katelyn. He had moved. He had remarried. The person taken into custody in April 2023 had spent 12 years as a free man while her family could not move at all. And the question that had defined this case for 12 years, why couldn't they arrest him, was immediately replaced by a new one. What did they finally have? In court documents, hearings, and legal proceedings following Carter's arrest, prosecutors began laying out their case. Their theory: John Carter was responsible for Katelyn Markham's death on or around the night of August 19, 2011. He was responsible for transporting her remains to the rural Preble County location where they were found 2 years later. Cell phone records were a central element. The same category of evidence that had been pulled in 2011, and that had been interesting but not conclusive at the time, had been reanalyzed using updated forensic methods. The data now supported a more specific reconstruction of where phones were and when, during the hours surrounding Katelyn's disappearance. Physical evidence was also presented. The precise nature of that evidence has been addressed in legal proceedings with varying degrees of public detail. What is documented is that investigators had preserved and continued to develop physical evidence across the years of the investigation. Witness accounts formed part of the case as well. Over 12 years, people who had known Carter and Katelyn had spoken with investigators. Some of what they described, behaviors before and after her disappearance, inconsistencies between what Carter told detectives and what others observed, found its way into the prosecution's presentation. The defense challenged each element. Cell phone data interpretation was contested. Physical evidence and its chain of custody over more than a decade was questioned. Witness accounts gathered years after the events they described were scrutinized for reliability and context. This is how the system is supposed to work. And it matters here, because the prosecution's case, built substantially on circumstantial evidence accumulated over more than a decade, was always going to face rigorous challenge. What emerged from the courtroom was a picture that was, in certain respects, clearer than anything the public had seen before, and in other respects, still contested. Throughout the investigation and into the legal proceedings, a set of contradictions accumulated that explain both why this case took so long and why it remained complicated even after an arrest. Consider this. Carter was interviewed by investigators multiple times over the years. Each time, he was released. No arrest. No charge. He cooperated, or performed cooperation, sufficiently that investigators could not hold him. Yet investigators kept returning to him. The same person, the same questions, the same focus, year after year. That combination, repeated interviews, continued release, unbroken investigative focus, describes a situation where authorities believed they had their answer but could not yet act on it. Consider this. Katelyn's remains were found in a rural county a meaningful distance from her Fairfield home. Getting to that location requires deliberate navigation. It is not somewhere you end up accidentally. Yet no witness ever came forward who could place anyone at that location on a specific night. No vehicle was reported. No sighting that connected a person to that field. The act of moving a body is inherently risky. It takes time, a vehicle, exposure to roads and potential witnesses. Yet for 2 years, Katelyn lay undiscovered. And for more than a decade, no witness account cleanly established how she got there. Consider this. The evidence cited in the 2023 arrest, cell phone records, physical evidence, witness accounts, was drawn substantially from materials that had existed for years. The records were there from the beginning. The digital footprint was there. Physical evidence had been preserved. What changed between the early investigation and the 2023 arrest is not fully established in the public record. It may have been forensic advances that made existing evidence more usable. It may have been witnesses who finally provided accounts they hadn't given before. It may have been the slow accumulation of detail that only becomes sufficient after years of patient work. Prosecutors don't explain their threshold. They charge when they believe they can win. What is clear is that something shifted, and that whatever shifted, it had not been present in the years before. There are things that are established. Katelyn Markham disappeared from her Fairfield, Ohio home on the night of August 19, 2011. She left everything behind. She was never seen alive again. Her remains were found in Preble County, Ohio, in 2013. Someone transported her there. She did not arrive on her own. John Carter, her fiancé, was arrested in April 2023 and charged in connection with her death. He had been under active investigative scrutiny for years before that arrest. Legal proceedings presented evidence and arguments from both prosecution and defense. There are things not fully established in the public record. The complete sequence of events on the night of August 19, what specifically happened, in what order, in what exact location, has been addressed in legal proceedings but not fully documented in a way that allows for public certainty on every point. The specific evidence that moved this case from long-running investigation to arrest has been described in broad terms. The full picture of what investigators developed, and how, has not been entirely disclosed. And there is the question the legal system never answers, even when everything else is resolved. Why? If Carter did this, and that determination belongs to the courts, what drove the events of that night? What were the specific minutes and circumstances that ended Katelyn Markham's life? What made a person decide to carry her to a field in a neighboring county and leave her there, and then go home and answer detectives' questions and walk out and keep walking out for 12 years? That question may never be fully answered. It lives in the space between legal verdict and human truth, a space that no courtroom fully closes. This documentary began with a promise. Her fiancé was never charged. Until 12 years later. The question embedded in that promise, why 12 years? Has a partial answer, though not the dramatic one people sometimes expect. No witness came forward with a deathbed confession. Carter did not make a high-profile mistake that suddenly exposed him. There was no hidden piece of evidence discovered in an attic. What the public record does show is that the investigation never closed, that evidence continued to be developed over many years, and that at some point prosecutors made a determination they had not made before, that the case was ready. Whether that moment came because of advances in forensic technology, because of witnesses who finally said what they knew, because of physical evidence that took years to fully analyze, or because of some combination of all of those things, the full answer to that question is not yet part of the public record. What is, investigators kept working. And eventually, the case moved. During those 12 years, Katelyn's family did something that deserves to be named directly. They refused to allow her case to become another unsolved file. They kept speaking her name when no one was asking. They gave interviews, participated in searches, maintained a public presence around a case that the news cycle had long since moved past. Not because it was guaranteed to produce results. Because the alternative, silence, acceptance, was not something they were willing to choose. The arrest of John Carter in April 2023 is where this story currently sits in the public record. Legal proceedings will determine guilt or innocence. That process deserves to complete itself. What is not in dispute is who Katelyn was. She was 22 years old. Her sketchbooks were on the table. She had a morning appointment with her father that she never kept. She had a life being built, a career, a relationship, a home of her own, that someone ended on a Friday night in August. 12 years is a long time to wait for accountability to begin. It is also, sometimes, exactly how long it takes. For Katelyn Markham, may whatever the court ultimately finds be the beginning of whatever measure of peace is still possible to give.
We've done this so many times. How are you feeling right now?
Relieved, grateful, thankful to the judge for giving him the maximum that he deserves. And this is, it's not over, and no, it's not closure, but it's the start of something else to come. And well, here we are. I don't know what to say. I'm thankful and grateful for the judge for handing out the sentence that he did.
What was it like for you to be able to stand there and speak those words, and with him hearing you finally?
Well, I wanted to address it to him, honestly, but the judge said that I was to address the court, not John. But I wanted him to hear it. I didn't, I haven't said my piece to John, and I hope that he got through. I hope I got my message through that he's responsible for this and he deserves what he got.
You touched on it, Dave, but what it sounded like you tried to convey to John, what has he taken from all of you for so long?
Just everyday life without Katelyn. I mean, my first child, we were very close, and I've expressed before that she had talent and she was going to go someplace, and I'll see a piece of art sometimes and just think that should be Katelyn's up there, or Katelyn should be doing something. And it was talked about how bubbly she was, and she never wanted to see somebody upset. She always tried to make somebody happy or improve their day. So she didn't just take that away from me. Any of her students or her fellow students that were having a bad day, they lost out too. The world lost a wonderful person. She would have been a wonderful contribution to this world.
Where do you